Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the incredible world of psychiatric medications. These drugs have literally changed millions of lives, but how do they actually work on our most complex organ, the brain? We're going to explore their history, the science behind them, and that constant tightrope walk between their amazing benefits and some pretty significant risks.
So let's just jump right in with the big question. How do you even begin to treat our most complex organ? It's a mind-boggling challenge, right? Well, today we're going to take a journey, starting with what you might call the first blunt instruments of psychiatric medicine, all the way to the highly specialized tools that clinicians use today.
Okay, so before we can talk about any specific drugs, we first have to meet their targets, and those are neurotransmitters. Think of them as the brain's chemical messengers, carrying signals from one cell to another. They're what these medications are designed to influence, to affect our mood, our thoughts, and our behavior. And some of the key players in our story are going to be dopamine, which you'll see as DA, and serotonin, often called 5-HT.
All right, so where does our story really begin? Well, it kicks off back in the mid-20th century with a class of drugs that absolutely turned mental health care on its head, the first-generation antipsychotics. They were a total game changer, but they came with a pretty serious cost.
Drugs like thorazine and haldol were nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, there was real hope for treating what are called the positive symptoms of psychosis, things like hallucinations and delusions. They worked by casting a really wide net, basically blocking a key dopamine receptor called D2. And while that worked, it was a bit of a blunt instrument approach, and that came with the price.
And here's the fascinating part, right? The side effects themselves actually gave us huge clues about what these drugs were doing in the brain. See, dopamine is also absolutely crucial for controlling our movement. So when you block it so broadly, you get this whole cluster of really troubling movement disorders known together as extrapyramidal side effects, or EPS.
This table does a great job of breaking it down, and the timeline here is so important. Within just hours of taking the drug, a person could get these severe, painful muscle spasms. A few weeks in, they could develop symptoms that looked almost exactly like Parkinson's disease. But the one that really scared everyone was tardive dyskinesia. These involuntary movements that could show up after months or even years and could be permanent. It was just a devastating trade-off.
So, obviously, this was a huge problem. You can't have a treatment that causes such debilitating side effects. It really forced researchers to go back to the drawing board to find a better way, to search for medications that could be much more precise.
And what they came up with created this really critical trade-off. The newer drugs, the second and third generations like Risperdal and Abilify, were much more targeted. They hit both dopamine and serotonin, which helped with not just the positive symptoms, but the negative ones too, like emotional withdrawal. And the best part? The risk of those awful movement disorders went way down. But a new problem emerged: metabolic syndrome.
So, to manage this new risk, clinicians had to start watching a whole different set of health stats. And that led to some really helpful tools, like this mnemonic, WWFAL. It's just a simple checklist to keep track of a patient's weight, waist circumference, fasting blood sugar, A1C, and lipids. It's a perfect example of how treatments are always evolving.
And this whole idea, this push for more precision, it wasn't just happening in the world of antipsychotics. That same quest completely revolutionized how we treat depression, and it led to the development of the SSRIs, which I'm sure you've heard of, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors.
The whole point of drugs like Prozac and Zoloft was that they worked selectively. They focused just on serotonin, and that precision targeting made them so much safer and easier for many people to take. But here's the thing, selective does not mean side effect free. And yep, you guessed it, there's another handy mnemonic for this one, the 7 S's, to help everyone remember the most common issues to look out for.
Okay, so this brings us to a really crucial point about all of these powerful medications. While most side effects are, manageable, some can escalate into a full-blown, life-threatening medical emergency. And one of the most serious ones with antipsychotics is a rare but incredibly dangerous condition called Neuroleptic Malignant Syndrome, or NMS.
And when NMS hits, you have to move fast. There is a very clear, very precise protocol. First thing, stop the medication immediately. Get the patient straight to the ICU. You have to start aggressive cooling to fight the super high fevers, you pump them with fluids, and you give them muscle relaxants, all while monitoring their vitals constantly. It's a really stark reminder of just how high the stakes can be.
But if you think that sounds like a balancing act, some conditions require something even more delicate. And there's probably no better example of this than the classic mood stabilizer for bipolar disorder, lithium.
Just look at that number on the screen. 0.5 to 1.2. That's it. That is the razor-thin window in a person's bloodstream where lithium is actually effective. It's this incredibly fine line between a dose that works and a dose that is dangerously toxic.
I mean, that is the very definition of a clinical tightrope. You stray just a tiny bit below that 0.5 mark and the medication does nothing. You go a little bit above 1.2 and you're risking serious toxicity. That's why anyone taking lithium has to get their blood levels, their kidneys, and their thyroid checked constantly. It's a huge commitment.
Okay, so to wrap things up, let's look at two more classes of medication that are perfect examples of this whole power and precaution theme. You can really think of them as double-edged swords.
So, on one edge of that sword, you've got your benzodiazepines, your Xanax, your Valium. They are incredibly effective at calming the storm of severe anxiety. They work by boosting GABA, which is basically the brain's main off switch. But their power is also their danger. That immediate relief comes with a really high risk of dependence, which is why they're almost always used only for short-term situations.
And on the other edge of that sword, psychostimulants, like Ritalin and Adderall, the go-to treatment for ADHD. They work by raising levels of dopamine and norepinephrine, and for many people, they are absolutely life-changing. They help bring focus and order to a scattered mind. But because they have a potential for misuse, they are very tightly controlled Schedule II drugs that require really careful management.
So when you step back and look at the whole story, you can see this clear evolution, right? From these pharmacological sledgehammers to much more precise scalpels. The whole journey has been about this endless balancing act. How do you maximize the incredible benefits for the mind while minimizing the risks to the body? It's a journey that's far from over, and it leaves us with one big question. What's the next frontier for medicating the mind?